So we're now going to sew the dart up in the four parts, and to do that, the first thing we're going to do is mark our dart with chalk. So rerun over the lines that you tacked, ensuring that you get your waistline in and the end of your dart point. You can now remove those tacks and begin basting your dart down. Now it's important to be very accurate with your dart, especially if you've got a stripe or a check running through it, which is why you begin by basting it. So to start off with, we're going to baste about 1/4 of an inch off the point and tack in. Again, this is thread on the single, and then I'm going to place the point of my needle in about 1/2 inch down from the point of the dart, and I'm going to match it up to the chalk mark on the other side, and I'm going to begin forming a running stitch, making sure that I go in and out of the darts on either side of those lines. This ensures that you are sewing the dart up accurately, and if you have a stripe or check, you are going to sew it up symmetrically. So again, in through one line, out through the other line, all the way down. Make sure that your waist points are matching up. And then make sure that the bottom of your dart is level in the fold, and that you haven't included more length on one side of the dart than the other. And then tap this little thread. Now we're going to go and machine this, but before we do, we're going to press the fold of the dart in, making sure that we press only the part of the dart that we're folding. We don't want to create a fold past the point of the dart, so I'm pressing this section here, and as soon as I get into the point, I'm no longer pressing across. And we're going to take a scrap of cloth, that's top cloth, from our little bundle. Here we have a little scrap. We're going to make sure that it is at least 1 inch wide, 1.5 inches, and at least the length of 1 inch from the top of your dart point down to the waist of the dart. So from here to about there. I'm going to snip this across just so it's a bit shorter. I'm going to press this cloth, I'm going to press the dart, and then we're going to go to the machine. So I'm going to lay my fore part with the front edge facing me. I'm going to start at the base of the dart, stitch just under a number 2, and begin sewing exactly where I basted. So I'm going to back tack up to the base of my dart and then begin sewing up to the waist. Then as I get to the waist, I'm going to take my scrap of cloth and I'm going to lay it in about an inch up from the waist position on the dart. I'm also going to make sure that I'm sewing it in the middle of that strip of cloth that I have. Now once I get to the point in the dart where it's getting smaller than 1/4 of an inch, I drop it down a couple of notches on the stitch length, and gradually as I get further up I keep dropping it. Up until I get to the point of the dart and I'm sewing tiny, tiny stitches. Now these mustn't be absolutely tiny, they just have to be reasonably small enough to hold the tip of the dart in place. As I'm sewing off the dart, I'm sewing a gradual line that's coming into the folded edge, and it needs to escape the folded edge and continue onto this strip of cloth as gradually as possible so as not to form a point. And make sure you exit it exactly where you marked on the cloth and keep sewing for a couple of inches. You then get something that looks like this, where I've exited exactly where I've marked with the chalk, and I've gradually just come off and continued sewing up that strip of cloth. I've now positioned my forepart with the dart point into the point of my sleeve board, and I'm going to remove my bastes. This can be a little bit tricky because we've sewn into them, so do so very, very delicately. Now that I've done that, I'm going to position the base of my dart nice and flat, and I'm going to cut up the middle of that fold up to the point where that strip of cloth is sewn. It's going to be a little bit tricky, so just be patient. Now once I get to the level where the strip of cloth is sewn, I'm going to grab only the top layer and I'm going to snip into that. So only that one top layer, I'm going to snip into that, into where the strip of cloth is sewn, like so. And then I'm going to press that flat with the iron. And then I'm going to press the strip of cloth one way and the double fold of dart cloth the other way. Again, making sure that your dart point is sitting right into the point of the sleeve board. And as you're going up, you're making sure that you're pulling the cloth ever so slightly to make sure that you're pressing exactly on the fold. And only press up to the point. Make sure that you dry that out nicely. You should end up with something that looks a bit like that. Trim this off to make sure that both sides look exactly symmetrical, so that if there are any press marks, they are the same on both sides. And then we can start trimming this strip of cloth. So your first step is to trim this first bit back about a ½ inch from the edge of your dart, all the way up. You then cut the first top strip at an angle of about 45 degrees into the point. I then want you to fold that back, pull the fold part down ever so slightly, and press it flat. Once that's done, stagger your layers by trimming this layer a ¼ inch further back. And again, we're now going to create a circle around the tip of the dart. Ensuring that there are no hard edges and everything is nice and neat. Trim the hard edges over here. And then ensure that the tip is nicely pressed open by folding it on the other side. And you can see what you've done is you've evened out the inlays either end so that your dart point is nice and flush. So we've made sure that that looks right. We flip it back over and we grab the tiniest bit of sticky and lay it right into the point, just to make sure that there's something in there to keep it down while it's getting canvassed into the fore part. Let that cool. Now we can go to our Donlan wedge. Position the point of your wedge into the point of your sleeve board. Remove any tacks that are still left. Close the wedge up. Grab a strip of sticky that you've cut with a rounded point to the end, making sure that everything is lining up nice and neatly. Position your sticky into the point and press it flush. Let that cool before moving it, and then baste it down so it's nice and secure. So our next step is to simply make sure that the run on our underarm cut is running nice and smoothly. Because we've taken the dart out, there can be a slight discrepancy in length, and we have one that's a bare 1/8 of an inch here. So I'm going to place my ruler above the dominant wedge and lay it into the run below the dominant wedge, and just take that tip out. You must make sure that this little discrepancy isn't bigger than 1/8 of an inch. If you're getting bigger than 1/8 of an inch, you've made a mistake in sewing up your dart, and that will have effects on fit. So the best thing to do would be to go back into your dart and see where you went wrong. But then, you just very simply pad this shut. Now this baste will come out when we put our pocket in, but while we're canvassing the coats, it'll ensure that the forepart remains closed in this area. Our next step is to line up our side body. Flip the forepart over, grab your side body, right side to right side, get your balance marks in by chalking very light lines. And begin basting this in place. Now we're going to baste a 1/2 inch in or a 1/4 of an inch in, so that 3/8 of an inch in from the raw edge is free and our stitch line on the machine doesn't interfere with our baste. See here that I'm making sure that as I'm going along, my notches are matching and that my raw edges are lining up with one another. Now, the reason why it's important for your notches to match is so that there aren't any discrepancies in length between one side of the seam and the other, which could form puckering. And your balance in your coat is going to be a very important element of your fit, and you can drastically alter the fit of the garment if these notches don't match. We're now going to go to the sewing machine and stitch 3/8 of an inch in from the raw edge. So as I'm stitching my side body, the foot of my machine sits 1/8 out from the edge of the cloth, and that will give you a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And delicately stitch all the way down. Remember, the foot at the top is wanting to push your top layer forwards, and the teeth at the bottom are wanting to pull your under layer back. So you need to make sure that the under layer is being pulled tight so that there isn't any gathered length in the top. I'm now going to take this baste out and press the seam open on the sleeve board. I now take my padded canvas and give it a fresh press, making sure that I press it over the ham in this section and ensuring that the entire canvas is laying nice and flat and flush. I then do the same for my forepart, which has now been attached to my side body, and I begin to lay everything in place. Now, my first step is to draw my break line in. Grab a piece of sharp chalk and mark it through. I then line up the top of my canvas with the top of my forepart. And because I've got the mark for my break line already in my canvas, I match these up very vaguely initially. I want to make sure that as I'm lining them up, my button position on the forepart, which I'm marking through with a cross here, is sitting close to where it is on the canvas, and that's laying spot on. Now that tells me that I've done my job right, and that the forepart is laying in the right area. By using this flipping method, I can ensure that both layers are exactly on top of one another, and I can start securing them in place with some basting stitches. Before I do that, I'm going to grab some pins. This will make my life a little bit easier and prevent shifting as I'm putting in this first baste. All I'm doing is I'm not pulling or pushing the cloth, I'm just laying it exactly where it wants to, break line on break line. I then grab a ruler, rulers are usually 1.25 inches or 1.5 inches thick, lay it into the mark stitch on my front edge and draw a little line. Now this is the first line of your canvassing. It is one of the most important ones. So make sure you take the time to get it right. I can put a knot in my thread. I start about 3/4 inch down from the top. Knot and backpack. I don't want this coming out. And simply stitch down that line, going through all layers. I'm not pulling, I'm just laying the top cloth on the canvas and running that all the way down. The reason why I'm not pulling in this section is because your bridle length will have a drastic effect on the fit. If you stretch this, the coat will begin to swing, that is to say it will shift away from the body. If you include length in it, it will run on and the quarters will sit on top of one another. Now I stop basting at that mark that I made and back tack firmly in place. And now take a pin, make sure that my button position is good, and I place the pin in the inlay at my button position. I can now remove these pins and I can begin securing padding with the lapel. Now I'm going to leave about 1 inch all the way around, padding like so. As I'm doing this, I'm shifting the cloth out. What I want to do, and this is the important canvassing principle, is create a deficit of length in the cloth that sits on top and an excess of length in the canvas that sits beneath, so that the canvas acts like a spring and pushes the top cloth out and makes it look nice and flush. So I'm pushing out and up here. And then heading up, my point. And then here I'm pushing out and down, out and down. And I stop at the same height as where I stopped on my break line. Every time I put a stitch of canvassing in, I make sure that there's no length in the section between the two stitches. If there is, I go back and do it again. This is a really key part of the coat making process. And if you do this badly, it can yield some really dreadful results. Now, I trace a line that sits about 2.5 inches down from my shoulder mark stitch, like so. You should trace a very discreet line. I'll trace one that's a little bit more pronounced for the video. And then, a ruler's width out from the break line, I chalk another line. This line here is put in place in order to prevent any cloth coming from the pad stitched in the lapel from being forced into the four-part canvas. If we don't do this, we can find ourselves with a little bit of an excess floating there beneath the lapel as it rolls back. So this is a securing canvassing line which will prevent any fluttering in this location. Now, as we get to these sections, we need to start thinking about the mound of cloth that's sitting at the dart point. So it's at this point that we need to grab the sleeve board and begin canvassing by removing shape. I'm going to place my four-part on my sleeve board, like so, and eliminate all the shape and disturbance that's been caused by the dart. I start tacking at that initial line that sits about 2.5 inches down from my shoulder mark stitch, and I'm going to start at this point canvassing and pulling. So I begin by pulling out and down, ever so slightly. These aren't firm pulls, they're slight tugs just to create a little bit of tension in the cloth. If you pull too hard, you're going to create a distortion in your pattern and the fit of the coat is going to change drastically. So you need to be very delicate with this section and simply pull ever so slightly just to create a tautness. With each successive stitch, I'm then relaying things flat, pulling ever so slightly, and stitching down. Now this is where your thimble is really going to become useful, because you've got 4 layers of thick cloth to get through. Make sure that your stitches are not sitting too far apart. And again, every time I put a stitch in, I'm relaying things and pulling. I then stop this stitch at the same height as where I stopped my break line. And back tack twice. Make sure that your stitches are not tight. Leave a little bit of length in your baste, because if they are tight, they're going to create disturbances in the canvassing process, and you might think that you've actually poorly canvassed, when in fact what you've done is you've left the stitches too tight. So if you can look there, you can see I've got a little bit of length sticking out of the stitch, which I distribute evenly throughout that line to make sure that the cloth isn't being disturbed. Now I carry this forwards. This time I'm going to start going down the dart. So for this, I'm going to begin by tracing a line around the armhole first, and then another line down the middle of the dart. So the line around the armhole needs to sit about 1.5 inches all the way around the armhole. So I place little marks there, and needs to come from this position there and curve down. The stitch line that comes down the middle of the dart needs to begin halfway between those 2 lines, approximately, and then come down the middle of the dart and to one side. It doesn't matter which side that is, just so long as it's not going straight down the middle. Now your next step is to do this initial line first, but you're going to want to leave an awful lot of excess thread. So take a long, long length, and begin your stitch. As I said, I'm laying the canvas flat and eliminating the length, the shape that the dart is inducing, by choosing where to place this canvas along the board. So in this section here, I'm laying it like so. And I'm beginning by pulling slightly and starting off my stitch. Like so. I then keep repositioning the forepart on the sleeve board and pulling ever so slightly to create that deficit of length in the top cloth as I'm canvassing. I'm now going to use the wider end of the board just to get through the tip of my dart. And then really crucially is the dart point. Make sure that it's nice and flat and canvassed out neatly. So I come into the dart point, and in this section I back tack once, and I leave a length of thread just hanging. Now what I'm doing is I'm lifting up the canvas and I'm making sure by holding it tight and holding it up that all my canvassing stitches are looking right and that there's no excess of cloth sitting between those lines. So you're constantly assessing your work as you're going along. If something looks off, you undo a stitch and redo it. So the same thing now, take a very, very long length of cotton, knot it, and begin your next line. Starting at that point there and canvassing out. So in this section here you need to be quite cautious. You've got a vague mark for your pitch in your canvas and these need to match up more or less. Make sure that you're not shifting your armhole down, as this will make canvassing later down the line quite difficult. This armhole needs to be lifted up nice and neatly to more or less match up with that pitch mark that you have. And again, pulling nice and neatly as you go around the side. Once you get to the end of the canvas, so you can see where it ends here, you come in the top cloth and back tack. I'm going to back tack twice here because this is going to be a delicate area, and I'm going to leave all that excess length of basting cotton loose. I now lift my job up, make sure that everything's canvassed nicely, and proceed to the next line. So, I can take my pin out, and now what I want to do is make sure that there's no cloth sitting in the button position here. I'm simply going to take my hand and push my canvas, my forepart, out to make sure that my front edge is sitting nice and neat. What that will do is it will pull it out from the canvas ever so slightly at the bottom, and your whole forepart is going to shift ever so slightly to this side. Once everything's laying nice and flat, take your ruler, line it up with the front edge, make sure your front edge is on grain. There will be disturbances occurring from your dominant wedge. So I'm just straightening out that front edge, and once I've done that, grab a couple pins and pin the inlay in place. This will determine the grain of your cloth against the canvas along the quarters. Your next line will be a line heading down an inch back from the front edge, and then it will curve round to just past the curve. The following line will go from that second line of basting down to the point that you just made. You'll then have a third line coming down the length of your dart. It will go round your pocket and sit away from it by a good inch, and then again down your forepart, and then your last line, you feel for the edge of the canvas going down, mark it in place, and then draw a line in from there by about 3/4 of an inch. And stop it about 1.5 inches up from your pocket. Your last lines of basting need to sit a good inch up from the bottom. I then leave this thread long, so I can come back to it at a later date. Again, going down and out, creating that deficit of length in between those stitch lines. I then come back to the sleeve board, and begin canvassing back down the dart by picking up that long bit of thread that I left over. Feeling nice and taut here. Stopping an inch and a half above the pocket. I then back tack, pad across, and down, and then back across beneath it. Back tack one last time there, and then finish off that last line. Last one. down, and stopping about 1.5 inches of the pocket. And finishing the last one at the bottom with this excess length of thread that I've left. You can now take out these pins and begin trimming your canvases to exactly the same shape as your full part. Ensuring that as you're curving down the armhole, everything is nice and flat. And that's your canvas full part. Make sure to check your work and see that everything is sitting nice and flush by pulling it up and making sure that it's draping correctly. So now that you've got your full part, we are going to mark exactly where it is you're going to need to pad stitch. So first things first is we're going to mark the lapel onto the other side of the canvas. To do this, we're going to grab a pencil, and I'm going to do it in a black chalk so that you can see the line a little bit better. But do not use this because it really does mark indelibly, and a pencil will be able to come out if you need it to. So grab your pencil and mark the other side. There. Like so. Mark your break line. I'm going to mark that with chalk because it's on my bridle. And then mark your button position. So, now that I've got everything in place, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the outline of where it is I need to pad stitch. First things first, we're going to determine how far up from the button it needs to come. Now, when you're padding, you're going to be creating little dimples on the underside of your lapel. You want to make sure that these dimples are not going to be visible once your lapel is rolling over. So if you can imagine your lapel rolling over like so, you're going to want to pad from above this point here. So that sits approximately, in this case, 4.5 inches up from the button position. Now this measure here differs from lapel to lapel, and the way you determine it is simply by rolling it back and judging approximately where that needs to be. There's no hard and fast rule, it's a case of working it out visually. So that is going to be the base from where we pad. Just take that out and create a sharper line. There. Then we're going to pad into the full bridle. So we're going to pad, I'm marking it, but essentially you don't need to, you know where the bridle ends. And then we're going to pad a 1/2 inch inside of the outside line that we've marked here. So, coming down from the collar, at the gorge, which is this line here, we're going to pad right up into it. But then, as we come into here, we're going to draw a line coming down, draw a line a 1/2 inch in, and then draw another line all the way in, a 1/2 inch coming down. And then into this point, we're just going to cut off the tip. And this is the section here. That you'll need to pad in your lapel. Now the way you pad it is by grabbing a thread that's the same colour as your top cloth. I'm going to grab a white thread here, just so you can see it a little bit more clearly. No knots. You start at the top, from this point inside, and what you're doing is you're coming down and padding out. As you're padding out, you're making sure that you're rolling the lapel and creating some shape in there. What we want to do is create a deficit of cloth on the underside and an excess of cloth on the top side, so that we're creating a curl which will then help to form that roll that the lapel will take. So as you're padding, you're coming in and you're taking a small bite, as you can see there, that little dimple mark where my needle's gone in, a tiny small bite into the cloth. I'll just back tack there, and I'll go up. Now, you would usually make these stitches 5/8 of an inch long approximately, going all the way up. And it's the same principle as padding your canvas, except that you're padding it with this curl, and you're easing a little bit of excess cloth on the top and a little bit of deficit on the bottom to allow for that roll. And I go all the way up and then back down, up and down until I reach the extremities, and I finished. What you should see on the underside are no more than those tiny little catchers. Now, because you'll be doing it in the same colour, they won't be quite so visible, and they'll just come across as little pricks in the cloth, which will then be hidden because the lapel is folded back. And here you have your padded lapel, as you can see, all along the bridle towards the outer lines that we drew. And if I reverse it, you'll see all these little pricks coming through to the other side, and the fact that this lapel has a tendency to now want to curl.